¿Cómo están ustedes? Bienvenidos a Encuentros del Futuro. Hoy para juntarnos, para conversar con una eminencia a nivel mundial de un tema tremendamente apasionante, la conciencia. Anil Seth es quien nos acompaña en el día de hoy. Mr. Seth, welcome to Chile, welcome to Encuentros del Futuro.
Muchas gracias.
Are we all hallucinating right now?
Yes and no. Let's start off with a difficult question there. When people talk about hallucinations, what they often mean is that you're really experiencing something that other people aren't, and maybe nothing is real, and it's all invented in the brain, and maybe we're just a brain in some laboratory, and there's some aliens making us experience. I don't think any of that is the case. What I do think is true is that we tend also to think of normal perception as just this direct reflection of what's actually out there in the world, that our eyes are a window onto the world, our ears are a window onto the world, and perception is just reading out what's actually out there. But I think that perception is not like that. It's an active process where we're generating our perceptions all the time, and sensory signals from the world are just helping calibrate these perceptions. So perception and hallucination are very continuous. They're very much the same thing. You tip the balance a little bit one way or the other, and you might start to perceive things that other people don't. And then, of course, we'll say, oh, you're hallucinating, you're hearing voices. But yeah, I think we are hallucinating all the time in the sense that all our perceptions are constructions. They're all generated. The brain is bringing something to everything we perceive.
Let's talk about that. How do we sense really the world? You say that brain is like a predictive engine.
Yeah.
How's that?
It's a pretty old idea, actually. So, way back in intellectual history, people, if you think about vision, for instance, there were some very old ideas that people thought eyes actually sent light out into the world, and that's how we see that the eyes are just sending out beams of light. And actually, there are some animals that do that, some fish somewhere or other. But this is a big problem. If light goes out, then it needs to come back in order to perceive anything in the way sonar works. So then there was another idea which came up in the Greeks already, that no, vision is about light coming in from the outside world. So the basic idea is light enters the eye, hits the retina, activates some cells there, and then gets deeper and deeper into the brain. And there's some picture of the world is built up through this process. That's been a dominant view in perception, especially in neuroscience, for a while. But the other view, and again, there's lots of history behind it. There's a really amazing Arabic scholar called Ibn al-Haytham, who thousands of years ago realized that perception can't be this direct. It has to be an inference, has to be a prediction. And Kant said something like this as well. And how we now understand it is that these signals that come into the eyes, they just carry the difference between what the brain is predicting and what it's getting at every level of processing. So perception really happens when the brain is generating a prediction of what's out there.
So we are guessing all the time?
We're guessing, yeah. It's a process of informed guesswork. We're guessing, and then we test our guesses against the sensory signals, and then we change our guesses. And of course, we're not aware of doing this. This is all happening under the surface, so to speak. But it's, yes, this process of continually refining our guesses about what's out there.
What happens when we make a mistake in our guessings about the world?
Then you'll start to see something that other people don't. But there's also a thing here. The function of perception is not necessarily to really reflect the world as it is. Sometimes we perceive things that deviate from reality, and it's useful to do that. Another tradition in psychology would say that we perceive things as it's useful for us to perceive them, not as they actually are. So, color is a good example. So colors don't exist out there in the world at all, even something as basic as that. Color is a trick of the brain so that we can keep track of objects when lighting conditions change. So if you take a white piece of paper from this room outside, it will still look white, even though the light that's coming into your eyes is changing. Now that isn't and wrong perception. It's a useful perception because it looks like the same object. But of course, if this process goes dramatically wrong, then you might start actually hallucinating and having vivid experiences that other people don't have. And of course, then that can be problematic.
So what we perceive as reality is really an hallucination that we all share?
Yes, so I think there is a real world out there. You know, I don't think anybody really knows that, but I'm quite happy with the idea that things out there in the world and in here actually exist, whether they're made of atoms or quarks or strings, or I don't know, but stuff is out there. There is a real world, but our experience of the world as real, now as compared to looking at a picture or when you feel, you know, sometimes after jet lag, you don't know, like, is this really, is it, you know, it doesn't seem as real as it does at other times. I think that's when our perceptual systems are working normally and when they're working in more or less the same way, me and you. So if we both agree that there's a table in front of us, we both see it the same way. That helps us perceive it as real.
If we change something in the brain, for example, with psychedelic drugs, how does this change our perception of reality?
This is a very interesting and actively researched question at the moment. There are many kinds of conscious experiences that we have depart from normal waking perception. Dreaming, for instance, but also in psychedelic drugs. People that have tried these drugs report very dramatic changes in their conscious experience. And to some extent, they know they're not real sometimes, but sometimes you think they are real. But certainly, you see things that other people don't. And in my research group and in other research groups as well, we're beginning to unravel the neural dynamics, the actual details of what's happening in the brain when this happens. And the hypothesis would be, what I think is going on, and others too, is that your predictions about what's out there in the world, your guesses, your brain's guesses, are becoming more powerful and less restrained by the sensory data. So if you look up at the sky on a cloudy day, sometimes you can see faces in clouds. Now, if you do that while you're on LSD, for instance, then you're really going to see faces in clouds. They're going to leap out at you. You project patterns into sensory data much more strongly than you do without psychedelics.
We as human beings tend to do that, to see faces in the clouds, not the other ways. Why is that? Why we try to see things like that, like see a face in the cloud?
It's a great example, actually, because faces for humans and for other animals as well, especially primates, are really important things in the world. You know, in order to guide our behavior, we're social animals. The face is the most important cue about whether somebody's going to kill you or whether they're going to give you food. And so we want to read people's faces. We need to recognize people. So part of the perceptual system we have is specialized, dedicated for dealing with faces. And so that means that when we just generally look around and there's all sensory information is somewhat ambiguous, but our brains will be geared up, will be predisposed to seeing faces in things. And there's even a word for this. It's called pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in things.
Some people have the problem that it's very difficult for them to identify faces.
Yeah. It's a condition called prosopagnosia, where they can still tell that an object is a face, but they find it very difficult to identify the face. And this is actually, when I started out in researching consciousness, these were some of the most interesting stories that the neurologist Oliver Sacks and people like him were describing, all these strange cases where people following some sort of brain damage, their experience of the world changed in a very unexpected way. So for instance, not recognizing faces or not being able to distinguish different kinds of objects, or for some people the whole left side of their world disappeared and they didn't even notice. Very strange phenomena that make you realize that we can't take for granted just the fact that I experience the world as it is, because some people don't.
We also have a tendency as human beings to try to understand the world in some kind of, let me take you again. For example, when the fake news why are the fake news so attractive for us? Why we wanna see things from a singular point of view and not see the reality as it is?
Yeah, and this is also, it's a really interesting connection. If you think about how, we've already talked a little bit about how perception is a process of refining the brain's guesses to minimize the error between what the brain is guessing is there and the sensory information that it gets. So there are actually two ways you can do this. You know, if there's a big difference between what my brain is expecting and what it's getting, well, I can change my perception. If I think I'm meeting one friend and it turns out to be another, well, it's the other. But the other way is that I can actually make actions. I can seek out the information that confirms the predictions that I already have. And this is, I think, what's going on all the time in our perception. So whenever I make eye movements, I mean, our eyes are darting around all the time. We make probably 100,000 eye movements a day, and you don't notice any of them. Yeah? And what we're doing when we make these eye movements is we're either interrogating, trying to find out new information, or we're trying to confirm the predictions we already have. When we use social media, when we choose expose ourselves to information, it makes sense for the brain to try to find the information that confirms what it already believes to be the case. And I think this is what's happening more broadly in society. You know, it used to be, certainly in England, we used to have this thing, everybody would watch the BBC news, yeah. So you're all getting, even if it was inaccurate, everybody was seeing the same thing. And then we'd say, no, it's good or bad. But now, of course, everybody looks at different news, is exposing themselves to different social media, and what's fake news for one person is real news for another.
Vamos a una pausa, solamente un minuto, nos separamos y luego volvemos en esta conversación con Anil Seth. Estamos de vuelta en Encuentros del Futuro, hoy conversando con Anil Seth. Mr. Seth, let's talk about the experience of being. How do we experience being a self?
It's something that's very easy to take for granted that, my experiences of the world might change depending on where I am. I'm in Chile now, was in Patagonia yesterday. But there's this idea that the self is always there, always in the background, that the self is the thing that is doing the perceiving and is not a perception. And I think actually that's wrong. We perceive being a self in exactly the same way that we perceive things in the outside world. There are sensory signals that are relevant to the self, like signals about where my body is in space, whether it's moving, what I'm doing. All of these signals that the brain then has to interpret that generate a perception of self. So it's a continually constructed process, this experience of being you or of being me. And it's one that's many different parts. I mean, we also think my experience of being me is unified. It all kind of hangs together. This is my body. I have a set of memories. There are things I like to do, things I don't like to do. I experience frustration. I experience emotion. We think of it as all part of an indivisible whole. But again, I don't think that's true. These are all different components of being a self that are built up and can be selectively lost and selectively changed. So we are a continuously unfolding perception.
Will my computer or my phone tomorrow be conscious?
I think this is a terrifically interesting question. I don't think so, but I can't rule it out. Now, it's a very tempting idea to think that the brain is some kind of computer and that if you program it the right way, it's going to become conscious. We've seen a vast development and acceleration in the technology of artificial intelligence over the last few years. And some people wonder whether, as these systems get smarter, whether it's my phone or my laptop, at some point they're going to become conscious and then maybe take over the world and enslave us all.
The Terminator scenario.
The Terminator scenario. And I think there's a lot of problems with that idea. First is the brain isn't a computer. There are some similarities, but there are also many, many differences. Computers are just really good at simulating things. That's how I use them in my lab. And now if you think about it, if you simulate a weather system, like people who work in meteorology do, you don't ever expect it to start raining inside the computer. So why should we expect a simulation of the brain to suddenly become conscious? Only if we think consciousness is purely a matter of information and information processing. But that's still just an assumption, and I don't know whether it's true, but I don't see any reason to assume that it's true. I think a lot of the intuition driving this is just we think consciousness is a matter of being intelligent, and we can now build computers that are intelligent, so they're going to become conscious. I don't think that's right.
And it's not a matter of being intelligent. Conscious is a matter of being alive?
I think there's a much closer tie to life than to intelligence.
Why?
Because brains evolved to keep the body alive. That's the primary purpose of having a nervous system, a brain at all, not just for humans, but for any other animal. Brains developed in order to regulate the body internally and then to generate behavior that would enabled organisms to run away from dangerous things and approach food, but all with the ultimate goal of staying alive. Intelligence comes along in the form that we think about it now in terms of solving complex problems, playing Go very well, driving autonomous cars. That's relatively recent, and it allows us to have different kinds of conscious experiences. So I might have a very unique conscious experience if I could play chess very well. I can't, or read and write great literature. But the most fundamental kinds of conscious experiences for me are things like emotions, feelings of pain, feelings of hunger, feelings of sadness, feelings of joy when you do something rewarding. And these have much more to do with the basic physiology, the basic properties of being alive.
And what about non-human animals that also share with us all this kind of thing?
That's right. So if we take the view that the mechanisms of perception that underlie our own conscious experiences have to do with life, then it's much easier to think that many other animals also have conscious experiences, not exactly like ours. I don't even know exactly what it's like to be you. I don't know what it's like to be a bat, as there's a famous philosopher who wrote a paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" So for me, it seems very natural to think that many other non-human animals have conscious experiences. It's a very difficult question to know where that ends. Where does it sort of just fade out into mere biological mechanisms? Is it at fish? Is it at rats? Is it at bacteria? And there's no good answer to that question yet.
When you talk about having conscious experience, these animals have probably an idea of being a self?
Maybe, but maybe not. So this is a very important point because, to my mind, there is no need, you don't have to have experience of being a self in order to have conscious experiences of the world. Certainly you don't have to have this reflective experience of self like humans do. I know my name is Anil, I know I experience myself as this entity over time. So I think that's also separable. It may be that other animals may have conscious experiences, but for instance, their experiences may not have a time, may not project into the future or remember the past. Part of our sense of self is very dependent on memory and thinking about the future. There was a wonderful paper, I read a research paper, studying rats and trying to figure out whether rats could feel regret or whether they were just merely disappointed. So regret, of course, is you do something, it turns out badly, but you could have done something else. Whereas disappointment is you do something, it turns out badly, and that's that. And I feel a lot of regret all the time, and trying to figure out whether a rat can, I thought was a lovely way to understand how animal minds might be different from human minds. They reckon, they thought they could. I'm still a bit suspicious.
Let's talk again about human beings. With all this experimentation and all this analysis, can we say that free will really exists?
Free will doesn't exist in the sense that some people wish it did. But that's not the kind of free will that I think we want. So there's one conception of free will, which is that we are biological machines. And at the core of this idea of being a self is the idea that we're in control of our actions, that we have free will over them. Now, I think that is true. I think we are in control of our actions. We are free always to behave according to our beliefs and our desires, unless we're being constrained, unless we're being actively prevented from doing so by being in prison or being under being instructed to not do that, or maybe being given some drug or some mental condition so we can't behave according to our volition. I think it's completely, that happens. The kind of free will that doesn't exist is this very spooky kind of free will where something that's totally outside the machinery of the brain is somehow affecting the cause of events, whether it's a soul or whether it's some other kind of consciousness that's not dependent on the brain. That kind of free will doesn't exist, but we wouldn't want that kind of free will anyway.
But how, I don't know if this is the correct way to put it, but we tend to think about ourselves as independent human beings that can act no matter the circumstances. Are we really independent, or finally our free will is too tied, too dependent to this kind of the way in which we perceive things?
Yeah, there's a scale, I think. I mean, we all have the experience of doing things that we're not aware that we actually did. If I have a glass of wine, I'll sort of drink it without even noticing, and that's a complex action that I'm doing without really being aware that I'm doing it. If I put my hand on something very hot, it'll come off, and I'll experience that as not voluntary. So I think there's a real scale. Some of our actions are very immediately constrained by our environment, and others are not. And they have what the scientist Patrick Haggard called a freedom from immediacy. And the more remote an action is from things that we can see in our immediate surroundings, the more the experience of volition, of will that we have, the more the causes are coming from inside ourselves rather than from the world. And it's when the causes come from more internal processes, that's when we experience that I was doing this independently or autonomously.
And to take our decisions, can we really rely on memory?
Well, we don't have much choice much of the time, but our memories are also continually changing, continually adaptive. Again, it's back to this computer metaphor. So it's tempting to think that human memory is like a computer. You store a file, you save your document, and then it's just going to be there. And assuming you don't lose the computer, it's going to be there. And when you retrieve it, it's going to be exactly the same. Now, human memory doesn't work like this at all. Our memories can be pretty inaccurate. The more often you recall them, the more likely they are to change. And of course, you can even have false memories of things that didn't happen. But they're still very useful. Memories are very useful for guiding our decisions and guiding our behavior, but we should never assume that they're completely accurate records of what happened.
Today in Santiago, you mentioned Francisco Varela.
Yes.
Maybe many people in Chile doesn't know them, doesn't know why he was so important. Can we say some words about him?
Yeah, well, I know he's famous in Chile, maybe for having a daughter who's a very famous actor.
Leonor Varela.
Leonor Varela. I first read Francisco Varela's work when I was doing my PhD at graduate school in the late 1990s in England. And I thought he was remarkable. His writings on consciousness and neuroscience were way ahead of the time, because unlike most neuroscientists at that time, he really took seriously what experience is like. Most people in neuroscience were thinking about how the brain generates behavior. What in the brain happens when I make an action, or when I say something, or if I perceive something. He was very interested in how the rich tapestry, the rich texture of our experience depends on things happening in the brain and on the connections between the brain and the body. So he was very early making these arguments that the brain isn't really a computer, that our experiences and perceptions depend on the deep links between the brain and the body, and taking very seriously that consciousness is at the center of these investigations. So I was greatly inspired by Virala's work, and I was very sad to never have the chance to meet him.
Anil Seth, thank you very much for your time and for this conversation with Encuentros del Futuro.
Muchas gracias, un placer.
Y muchas gracias también a ustedes por habernos acompañado hoy en Encuentros del Futuro.